Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the philosophy of theism by Borden Parker Bowne, published in 1902. We're going to take a look at chapter 4. We're going to take a look at pages 139 to 171, titled The Attributes of the World Ground. And beginning with page 139, we're going to start looking at the more traditional approach to the doctrine of God and how that is revised, having first begun with Bowne's phenomenology. So he's going to take up the attributes, which is normally the first step in the doctrine of God, but it's going to be a revised and clarified position based on the phenomenology we had from pages 1 to 139. And the best way to summarize the attributes is to look at, take a look in the chart, take a look at block 3, the title to block 3, because it's the summary statement of what he's going to say concerning the attributes. And Bowne goes on to say that the unifying God goes out of himself in immanent omnipresence and then returns to himself in omnipotent, constituting of himself as absolute spirit. In other words, God in himself is the unifying God. Going out of himself, he is the immanent omnipresence. But then he works through this immanent omnipresence to lift all of creation into the constituting of himself as absolute spirit. So it's the uplifting or resurrection power of spirit that will lift creation into new being. So let's begin with the foundational category in block 1, and that is the attribute of unifying. Unity of world ground is the first metaphysical attribute. It's based on the study of interaction. All true realities are uncompounded units, says Bowne. This unity also contains provision for manifoldness and complexity. This is a unity of a free, conscious self. Remember, God is personal. It is the unity of a free, conscious self. So under note 2, free and conscious self, it is grasped through the rational reflection. Free intelligence, by originating activity, posits plurality and maintains the unity of the plurality. So it's a unity within, or plurality within unity. Unity gives birth to plurality without destroying it. So unity plus free intelligence equals a unified plurality. The identical changes and yet abides, and this takes place on the plane of self-conscious intelligence. All things are bound up in a common schema of interaction. Remember our composite that we just looked at. Remember that internal triad that we had was uniformity, schema, and ontological demonstration. Remember, uniformity, then schema, and then ontological demonstration. So Bowne emphasizes that schema here, that all things are bound up in a common schema of interaction. So under note 4, the schema of interaction being Bowne's system, all that is flows from this system. And the steps in discerning this schema, first we begin with general notions, then we form members of class and notions of true, then we systematize these ideas, then we refer these ideas to one world ground. And this unity is a one fundamental existence. So we have a foundational category, and the category is going to abbreviate all conceptual attributes. All conceptual attributes are abbreviated under the category of God as unifying. Because for Bowne, fundamentally, God is self-conscious, unifying being. Absolute self-conscious, unifying being. So all attributes are enclosed within that category. So in block 2, we take a look at unchangeable, omnipresent, and eternity as conceptual attributes abbreviated under, the categorical attribute of the unifying. We begin with unchangeable. However, this is not at the expense of losing the living personal God. God does not possess rigid sameness of existence. In reality, this addresses the continuity of rule of the changing states. There is continuity in the divine nature. There is a constancy in personality of God. So under this constancy in personality takes place through the power of divine self-consciousness. God is the abiding identity. Plurality is gathered up in this attribute of abiding identity. Then we look at omnipresence. The entire being is present at every moment as immediate action, which extends to all things, as immediate thought that extends to all things. God is immanent in all things. Finite reality has its being in God's omnipresence. Then we'll take a look at eternity. Time itself is the form of change and not an independent reality, says Bowne. God is in full possession of himself. God in himself transcends temporal limits. God grasps reality in constituting it as all present. But it's all about God's immediate action that extends to all things and God's immediate thought that extends to all things. That defines his immanence. And that takes us on to block 3. We have our category and we have our concepts abbreviated under the category of unifying. And so now we take a look at how God constitutes himself as absolute spirit through this unifying self-conscious activity. So in block 3 we'll begin with omniscience and omnipotence. Omniscience equals freedom and foreknowledge as unified in an all-embracing presence of God. Under omnipotence, the world ground is agent, unconditioned agent. Laws are consequence of God's being. Truth is consequence of God's being. World ground is the foundation of all law and all truth. And then under truth, Bowne wants to give us more information. He says, truth is founded in world ground. Truth is the fixed mode of God's procedure, of his acting. Rational principles are expressions of God's nature and activity. God is agent, and God has a definite law of action. God's freedom is based on uniformity. That's the necessary side. God's freedom is also his self-determination. That's the freedom side. That which is true for the finite self is absolutely true for God, says Bowne. Therefore, he gives the following definition. Omnipotence equals God's presence to give meaning to the given powerless necessity. And this is God constituting himself as absolute spirit. Remember, Edgar Sheffield Brightman called the powerless necessity the given. But Bowne, who was Brightman's teacher, he defines it as the presence of God in giving meaning to all things by overpowering and being immanent even in all powerless necessity. Not the given, but powerless necessity. That is how he defines the given. So this is the definition that Edgar Sheffield Brightman worked off of. God's present to give meaning to powerless necessity. And this is God constituting himself as absolute spirit. So the traditional doctrine of God in systematic theology is taken up in chapter 4. But it is quite a bit more refined and much better than just mere abstract concepts, because Bowne always addresses the doctrine of God from the point of view of phenomenology. So we get much better detail then it makes more sense concerning God's kingdom by approaching it this way. And fundamentally, God's kingdom is a kingdom of the self-conscious unifying work of God. And in order to become that self-conscious unifying activity, God goes out of himself in immanent omnipresence. In other words, incarnation. God is incarnate in all of creation, lifting it, egeiro, lifting it to new resurrection life, restoring it to union with himself. That takes place through the immanent omnipresence. Therefore, that foundational category of unifying and that immanent omnipresence brings about God constituting himself through his creation as absolute spirit that lifts all of creation into perfect reunion with himself. And that means it's all about truth. It's all about God being uniform in the way that he acts. And it's all about God's self-determination, which includes taking up all of creation that does exist within God. Therefore, we have a completely new understanding of omnipotence. Omnipotence is God's being present to give meaning to all powerless necessity. In that way, God constitutes himself as the absolute spirit that is lifting all of creation into reunion with himself. That's omnipotence. Omnipotence is sanctifying creation through truth. And what do we know about truth? Christ's word is truth. Remember, I will send the Spirit of truth to sanctify you, and Christ's word is truth. The Spirit of truth does create sanctification. In this case, it's Bowne's definition of omnipotence. It doesn't just mean God is all-powerful. It means that God gives meaning to all powerless necessity and thereby constitutes himself in this self-conscious activity of lifting all of creation into reunion with himself in absolute spirit. God is the unifying ground of all creation. He is absolute spirit. So we get the traditional systematic theology here, beginning with page 139. But in Professor Bowne's case, we don't just start listing things like omnipotence, omnipresence, immutability, etc., etc., etc. He doesn't just list a bunch of abstract concepts. No, he's very deliberate, and he bases everything in phenomenology. So we begin with a foundational category of unifying. And then we move through the second moment of immanent omnipresence. And then we move on to the return moment in omnipotent constituting of himself as absolute spirit. So it is a triad. The attributes of God make up a triad. There's the foundational category, which abbreviates the conceptual attributes, which all work together to bring about egeiro, raising up of creation into reunion with God's self as absolute spirit, which defines the new definition of omnipotence for Professor Bowne. So that gives us a great look at Chapter 4 and a revised look at the traditional doctrine of God. We're going to pick up next time on Chapter 5.